Hey everyone, what's going on? This is Jacob Kane. This is the Jake Take Report. I just wanted to talk to you all about Eugene Debs today, and if you haven't heard about Eugene Debs, I encourage you to look him up. He's an amazing person. He was an amazing person, and he's kind of a pioneer for workers' rights and labor rights in the U.S. So I encourage you to look into him. I'm going to go into him just a little bit, not too much in depth. I encourage you to look into him further. Thank you so much. Eugene Debs was born on November 5th, 1855 in Terre Haute, Indiana. He was born to French immigrants, and his father came from a prosperous family. He had a textile market and a textile mill and a meat market. Debs attended public school and dropped out at 14, kind of common back in the industrial era. He took a job at the Vandalia Railroad. He was cleaning the grease out of the freight engines of the trucks for 50 cents a day. And then he eventually became a painter and car cleaner in the railroad shops. In December 1871, someone had failed to show up at work, and it made Debs get pushed into a position to be a night fireman. If you know anything about firefighting back in that time, it was a lot more dangerous, and the workers would just get killed trying to feed the engine with coal. It could explode. It was a very dangerous job for workers. He'd also became a grocery wholesale worker, and he remained there for 4 years while attending business school at night. Some of his political activism, he joined the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, the BLF, in February 1875, and he became very active in the organization. In 1877, he served as a delegate of the Terre Haute Lodge to the organization's national convention. Eugene Debs was elected associate editor to the BLF's monthly press, the Fireman's Magazine, in 1878. 2 years later, he was appointed Grand Secretary and Treasurer of the BLF and editor of the magazine in July 1880. He also became a prominent figure in the community at that time, and he actually served 2 terms as Terre Haute's city clerk from September 1879 to September 1883. In the fall of 1884, he was elected to the Indiana General Assembly as a Democrat, serving 1 term. So he started out as a Democrat. He later went on to say that he was just as disgusted being a Democrat as he was proud going to jail. As you already know, Eugene Debs worked for the railroad, so he was very familiar with it, and he started getting into railroad activism. In case you don't know, firemen in the railroad were... Early Debs' writing stressed the themes of self-upliftment. He was about temperance, hard work, and honesty. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, BLF, didn't have a strike from its founding in 1873 to 1887, which Debs was actually proud of. Historian David A. Shannon went on to say that Eugene Debs' desideratum was one of peace and cooperation between labor and capital, but he expected management to treat labor with respect, honor, and social equality. Over time, Debs became more convinced that there needed to be more of a confrontational and unified approach to the railroads, as they were powerful forces in the economy. He stepped down as the BLF Grand Secretary in 1893 and organized and founded one of the first industrial unions in the U.S., the American Railway Union, or ARU. This was for workers that were unskilled. It was for all workers of all positions in the railway and the railroad industry. And basically, he was trying to get them all unified together for the purpose of uplifting their rights in the workforce and guaranteeing them just basic human rights. Eugene Debs was elected president upon the ARU's founding, and the American Railway Union had a successful strike with the Great Northern Railway in April 1894, where it won most of its demands. Beginning in August of 1893, the Great Northern Railway enacted a series of wage cuts for its workers. Reductions amounted to $146,500 a month total, which in today's terms, that's anywhere from $3.83 million to $202 million, depending on how you calculate it. The American Railway Union organized all classes of employees to strike, lasting 18 days and forcing the company to arbitration of its unilateral wage cuts. This was the American Railway Union's first and only victory. The Pullman Strike! First, I want to get into the Pullman Company town. Back then, it wasn't too uncommon to have towns owned by businessmen that had a plant on the land. In these types of towns, the businessmen owned everything. So that's the grocery store, the theaters, the shops, everything. So all the money made by the workers went right back into George Pullman's hands. George Pullman created and engineered something called the Pullman Palace Car, which was very popular among wealthy Americans. Since the Emancipation Proclamation, the company hired African American freedmen as Pullman porters. As they were paid relatively well, which, let's think about it, relatively compared to slavery is not much more, and got to travel the country, the position became considered prestigious, and Pullman porters were respected in the black communities. He believed that former house slaves had the right type of training to serve the businessmen who would patronize his palace cars. Whatever that means. Pullman became the biggest single employer of African Americans in the U.S. George thought everything was great with this town, no distractions, loyal, happy workforce, no saloons, no agitators, etc., etc. The town gained nationwide attention, it had a lot of visitors, it was very pretty, a lot of nice things, and according to mortality statistics, it was one of the most healthful places in the world. George still expected the town to make a profit as an enterprise. By 1892, the community was valued at over $5 million. It was said that Pullman ruled the town like a feudal baron. He prohibited independent newspapers, public speeches, town meetings, or open discussion. His inspectors regularly entered homes to inspect for cleanliness and could terminate workers' leases on 10 days' notice. The church stood empty since no approved denomination could pay rent and no other congregation was allowed. He also prohibited private charities. In 1885, Richard Ely wrote in Harper's Weekly that the power exercised by Otto von Bismarck, a unifier of modern Germany, was utterly insignificant when compared with the ruling authority of the Pullman Palace Car Company in Pullman, Illinois. Apparently, some alleged Pullman employees wrote, "We are born in a Pullman house, fed from the Pullman shops, taught in the Pullman school, catechized in the Pullman church, and when we die we shall go to the Pullman hell." In 1894 was the Pullman strike. George Pullman cut the wages of employees by 28%, some say 30 to 50%. He cited the falling revenue due to the Panic of 1893. This was not unusual for robber barons at the time. Even though he cut wages, he didn't cut costs on any goods in the town or any of the rent. It was all because he guaranteed his investors a 6% return. Did we not see that today? It was said that a workman might make $9.07 a fortnight or 2 weeks. The rent of $9 would be taken directly out of their paycheck, leaving them with 7 cents to feed their family. One worker later testified, "I've seen men with families of 8 or 9 children crying because they got only 3 or 4 cents after paying their rent." Many of the workers for Pullman were already a part of the American Railway Union, and they appealed to the American Railway Union for support in the convention in Chicago, Illinois. Debs actually tried to persuade union members that the boycott was too risky. He felt with the hostility of the railways and the federal government and the union being too weak, it just wasn't worth the fight right now. On May 12, 1894, the workers went on the strike anyway. All the membership ignored Debs' warnings and refused to handle Pullman cars. They also refused to handle any cars attached to them, including U.S. mail. Another ARU board director extended the strike to St. Louis, doubling its size to 80,000 workers. Debs relented and decided to take part in the strike, given that all of ARU's members had essentially endorsed it. Strikers fought by establishing boycotts of Pullman train cars, and with Debs' eventual leadership, it came to be known as the Debs Rebellion. On July 8th, the federal government intervened. They obtained an injunction against the strike on the grounds that the strikers were stopping U.S. mail. U.S. mail is more important than workers, apparently. President Grover Cleveland sent the U.S. Army in to enforce the injunction. Debs had supported President Cleveland in all 3 of his presidential campaigns. 30 strikers were killed and thousands blacklisted. An estimated $80 million worth of property was destroyed, and Debs was found guilty of contempt of court for violating the injunction and sent to federal prison. On July 9th, 1894, the New York Times editorial called Debs a lawbreaker at large, an enemy of the human race. Remember, these papers were owned by the same people like George Pullman. Because Grover Cleveland felt bad that he sided with George Pullman, he gave us a holiday, Labor Day. 6 days after the strike, President Cleveland and Congress made it an official holiday. George Pullman's reputation was actually really tarnished by the strike and the subsequent investigation by the president and the administration. The National Commission report found Pullman's paternalism partially to blame. Described Pullman's town as un-American, can you imagine? The report condemned Pullman for refusing to negotiate the economic hardships of his workers in the town. He created them. The report said the aesthetic features are admired by visitors, but have little money value to its employees, especially when they lack bread. The state of Illinois filed suit and forced it to annex into Chicago. George Pullman was hated by his employees so much that he decided to make his burial extra special. He didn't want anyone to dig up his body. I'm going to have to read this one because this one's going to be difficult to remember. His family, most likely by his request, arranged for his remains to be placed in a lead-lined mahogany coffin, which was then sealed inside a block of concrete. At the cemetery, a large pit had been dug at the family plot, as its base and walls were 18 inches of reinforced concrete. The coffin was lowered and covered with asphalt and tar paper. More concrete was poured on top, followed by a layer of steel rails bolted together at right angles, and another layer of concrete. The entire burial process took 2 days. Poor Pullman. For the conspiracy theorists out there, Pullman was a 33rd degree Freemason. The Pullman strike put many union members in jail, including Debs. At the time of Debs' arrest, he was not yet a radical socialist. Debs recalled several years later, "I began to read and think and dissect the anatomy of the system in which working men, however organized, could be shattered and battered and splintered at a single stroke. The writings of Bellamy and Blatchford early appealed to me. The cooperative commonwealth of Groenland also impressed me, but the writings of Kautsky were so clear and conclusive that I readily grasped not merely his argument, but also caught the spirit of his socialist utterance, and I thank him and all who helped me out of darkness into light." It's like a religion. It's a cult. After Debs was released from prison in 1895, he started his socialist political career. Because the ARU membership was kind of shattered after the strike, he convinced it to join with the Brotherhood of Cooperative Commonwealth to found the social democracy of America. Believe it or not, like I said before, a lot of this stuff is more nuanced, and there's a lot of fighting between and inside parties. Some people on the socialist side wanted to launch communities and built them off a socialist example so others could see. Others favored establishment of a more European style where the people voted in the Socialist Party to the government. Eugene Debs ran for president 5 times, in 1900, 1904, 1908, 1912, and 1920, from prison. In 1912, Debs received 6% of the popular vote. He went on to found the Industrial Workers of the World and continued more of his fight for workers' rights, especially for the railway. But there were more socialist splits in the organization. Some socialists preferred to the parliamentary socialists as being more step-at-a-time people whose every step is just a little shorter than the preceding step. And the parliamentary socialists considered those socialists to be anarchists and communists and everything else. This led to a split of the Socialist Party and also the IWW. Prior to the split, the Socialist Party membership reached an all-time high of 135,000 members. 4 months after, the membership dropped to 80,000. It shows how much of an ideological split there is. The party never recovered since then. Eugene Debs was noted to be a charismatic speaker. Howard Zinn said that Debs was what every socialist or anarchist or radical should be. Fierce in his convictions, kind and compassionate in his personal relations. Haywood Brown noted in his eulogy for Debs, "That old man with the burning eyes actually believes that there can be such a thing as brotherhood of man." And that's not the funniest part of it. As long as he's around, I believe it myself. Although sometimes called King Debs, Eugene wasn't really wholly comfortable with his standing as a leader. He's quoted as saying, "I am not a labor leader. I do not want you to follow me or anyone else. If you are looking for a Moses to lead you out of this capitalist wilderness, you will stay right where you are. I will not lead you into the promised land if I could, because if I led you in, someone else would lead you out. You must use your heads as well as your hands and get yourself out of your present condition." Debs had speeches against Woodrow Wilson and his administration, especially during World War I, in our involvement. Woodrow Wilson later called Debs a traitor to this country. On June 30th, he was arrested and charged with 10 counts of sedition due to a speech in Ohio in which he urged resistance of the military draft of World War I. His trial defense called no witnesses, asking that Debs be allowed to address the court in his own defense. This was pretty unusual at the time. Debs spoke for 2 hours though. Then he was found guilty on September 12th. At his sentencing hearing on September 14th, he again addressed the court, and his speech has become a classic. Haywood Brown, a liberal journalist and not a Debs partisan, said it was one of the most beautiful and moving passages in the English language. He was for that one afternoon touched with inspiration. If anyone told me that tongues of fire danced upon his shoulders as he spoke, I would believe it. I encourage you to look up that speech online, as it is excellent. Debs was sentenced on September 18th, 1918 to 10 years in prison and was also disenfranchised for life. Debs said in his sentencing hearing, "Your Honor, years ago I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it, and while there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free." In protest of his jailing, Charles Ruthenberg led a parade of Unionists, Socialists, Anarchists, and Communists to march on May 1st, May Day, in Cleveland, Ohio. The event quickly broke into violent May Day riots of 1919. As I said before, during Eugene Debs' time in prison, he still ran for president. He also wrote a series of columns deeply critical of the prison system. Woodrow Wilson would not pardon Debs, even though Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General had recommended the pardon 4 times. The last time that Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer asked for Debs to be pardoned was when his health was deteriorating in prison. Wilson returned the paperwork after writing denied across the appeal. The next president, Warren G. Harding, commuted Debs' sentence, even though not officially pardoning him. He was set to be released on Christmas Day. When Debs was released from the Atlanta penitentiary, the other prisoners sent him off with a roar of cheers. A crowd of 50,000 greeted his return to Terre Haute, Indiana, to the accompaniment of band music. He spent his remaining years trying to recover from his health, which was severely undermined in federal prison. Does that sound familiar? Julian Assange was also tried under the Espionage Act of 1917, just like Eugene Debs. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer even argued back then that if someone was charged under the Espionage Act of 1917, then they should be released after war. Eugene Debs died of heart failure on October 20th, 1926 at the age of 70 in Lindlair Sanitarium in Elmhurst, Illinois. His body was cremated and buried in Highland Lawn Cemetery in Terre Haute, Indiana. His legacy is great. Debs helped motivate the American left to organize political opposition to corporations in World War I. Debs' home is still in Terre Haute, Indiana, and monitored by the National Park Service. In 1990, the Department of Labor named Debs to its Labor Hall of Fame. The town of Debs, Minnesota is named after Debs. Former New York radio station, WEVD, which is now ESPN Radio, was named after Debs as well. Debs Place is a housing block in Co-op City in Bronx, New York, and it's named in his honor. The Eugene V. Debs Cooperative House in Ann Arbor, Michigan was named after Debs. There are at least 2 beers named after Eugene Debs, Debs Red Ale, and Eugene. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Once again, this is the Jake Take Report. I'm your host, Jacob Kane. Have a lovely day, and look more into Eugene Debs for all of us. Much love. Peace. Later.